In the scorching heat of a military parade ground, surrounded by 1,000 watching soldiers, Admiral Robert Hensley raised his hand against someone he never imagined would fight back. What happened next would shake the foundations of military hierarchy, challenge decades of unchecked authority, and prove that courage comes in the most unexpected forms. This is the true story of Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a woman who refused to be silenced, and the single moment of retaliation that would transform her from an unknown officer into a symbol of resistance that the entire military would never forget. Some moments define us. Some moments define history. This was both. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood perfectly still in the blazing Arizona sun, her uniform crisp despite the sweat that threatened to betray her composure. The military base stretched endlessly around her, a testament to American naval power, but today it felt more like a prison. She had been stationed at Naval Air Station Phoenix for 18 months, and every single day had been a battle she never signed up for. The morning had started like any other. Sarah woke at 0500 hours, completed her physical training, showered, and prepared for another day of proving herself worthy of the respect that seemed to come automatically to her male colleagues. At 28 years old, she had already distinguished herself as one of the finest logistics officers in the Navy, graduating top of her class from the Naval Academy and earning commendations that filled a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. But none of that seemed to matter to Admiral Robert Hensley. Hensley was a man carved from granite and tradition. His 62 years of life spent entirely within the rigid structure of military hierarchy. He commanded respect through fear rather than admiration, and his weathered face bore the permanent scowl of someone who believed the world owed him deference simply for existing. He had been running Naval Air Station Phoenix for 7 years, and in that time he had made it clear that women in the military were, at best, a necessary evil he tolerated rather than embraced. Sarah had first encountered the Admiral's particular brand of hostility during her initial assignment briefing. While other officers received handshakes and welcomes, Sarah received a cold stare and a comment that would haunt her for months. "Lieutenant, I hope you understand that this isn't a place for delicate flowers. We run a tight ship here, and I won't have standards lowered for anyone." The words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they revealed a fundamental assumption about her capabilities based solely on her gender. Sarah had spent her entire life proving such assumptions wrong. From her childhood in rural Montana, where she outworked every boy on her family's ranch, to her academic achievements that earned her a full scholarship to the Naval Academy. Over the following months, the Admiral's hostility manifested in countless small cruelties. Important briefings where she wasn't invited despite her role requiring attendance. Assignments that seemed designed to set her up for failure. Comments made just loud enough for others to hear about women not belonging in combat roles. Even though Sarah was a logistics officer who had never requested combat assignment, the breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in September. Sarah had spent 3 weeks preparing a comprehensive logistics report that could save the base millions of dollars in unnecessary expenditures. Her research was thorough, her recommendations sound, and her presentation flawless. She had double and triple checked every figure, knowing that any mistake would be magnified and used against her. The conference room was filled with senior officers when Sarah presented her findings. For 45 minutes, she outlined systematic inefficiencies in supply chain management, equipment procurement delays that cost both time and money, and strategic reallocations that could improve operational readiness by 30%. The room was silent except for the soft scratch of pens taking notes and the occasional murmur of approval. When she finished, Captain Rodriguez was the first to speak. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant. This level of analysis is exactly what we need to streamline operations." Commander Walsh nodded in agreement. "The cost savings alone justify implementing these changes immediately." But Admiral Hensley sat silent, his face growing darker with each word of praise directed towards Sarah. Finally, he spoke, his voice cutting through the positive atmosphere like a blade. "Gentlemen, I'm disappointed that you're so easily impressed by a presentation that lacks practical understanding of real military operations." His eyes fixed on Sarah with undisguised contempt. "Lieutenant Mitchell, your recommendations show a fundamental misunderstanding of how things actually work in the field. This academic exercise might impress civilians, but it has no place in serious military planning." The room fell silent. Sarah felt her heart pounding, but she kept her voice steady. "Sir, with respect, my recommendations are based on 18 months of direct observation and analysis of our current operations. The data supports every conclusion I've drawn." Hensley's face flushed red. "Lieutenant, are you contradicting me?" "No, sir. I'm supporting my work with facts." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Other officers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing they were witnessing something that went far beyond professional disagreement. Your facts, Hensley spat, are meaningless without understanding.
And understanding comes from experience, not from reading textbooks and playing with spreadsheets. He stood up, his imposing frame casting a shadow across the conference table.
This is exactly why women don't belong in positions of real responsibility. You can organize supply closets and file reports, but don't pretend you understand military strategy. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah knew that how she responded would define not only this moment, but potentially the rest of her military career. She could back down, apologize, and accept the humiliation. Or she could stand her ground and face whatever consequences followed. Admiral, my gender has nothing to do with the quality of my analysis or my understanding of military operations, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly throughout the silent room. I've earned my position through merit, and my recommendations deserve consideration based on their validity, not dismissed because of your personal biases. The silence that followed was deafening. Admiral Hensley's face went from red to purple, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. In 34 years of military service, no one had ever spoken to him like that. Especially not a female lieutenant barely 5 years out of the academy. Meeting dismissed, he said through gritted teeth. Everyone except Lieutenant Mitchell. The other officers filed out quickly, avoiding eye contact with either Sarah or the Admiral. When the last door closed, Hensley walked slowly around the table until he stood directly in front of her. Lieutenant, you've just made the biggest mistake of your military career, he said softly, his voice carrying more menace than any shout. I don't know what gave you the impression that you could speak to me like that, but I guarantee you'll regret it. Sarah remained at attention, her eyes fixed on the flag behind his desk. I spoke truthfully, sir. If that's a mistake, then I'm willing to live with the consequences. Oh, you will, Hensley promised. You absolutely will. The next 3 months were a masterclass in institutional harassment. Sarah found herself assigned to every unpleasant duty the Admiral could devise, weekend shifts that materialized without warning, equipment inspections in the hottest parts of the base during the peak summer heat, administrative duties that seemed designed to bury her under an avalanche of meaningless paperwork. But Sarah endured it all. She completed every assignment perfectly, filed every report on time, and maintained the same professional standard that had earned her recognition throughout her career. She documented everything, knowing that creating a paper trail might be her only protection. The harassment might have continued indefinitely, if not for the surprise inspection announced by the Pentagon. A team of senior officials would be visiting Naval Air Station Phoenix to evaluate operational efficiency and recommend budget allocations for the following year. It was exactly the kind of review where Sarah's logistics expertise would be invaluable. Admiral Hensley found himself in an impossible position. He needed the inspection to go perfectly to secure funding for his pet projects. But the person best qualified to ensure success was the same lieutenant he had been systematically undermining for months. 3 days before the inspection, he called Sarah to his office. Lieutenant, I'm assigning you to coordinate logistics support for the upcoming inspection, he said without preamble. I expect everything to run smoothly. Sarah studied his face, looking for any sign of the trap she was certain this represented. Yes, sir. I'll need access to current inventory reports, maintenance schedules, and personnel assignments. You'll have whatever you need, Hensley said. But understand this, Lieutenant. If anything goes wrong, if there's even the slightest problem with logistics during this inspection, I'll hold you personally responsible. Your career will be over. It was a classic double bind. Sarah could succeed and receive no credit, or fail and take all the blame. But she had no choice but to accept. Understood, sir. The next 72 hours were a blur of activity. Sarah worked 18-hour days, coordinating with department heads, verifying inventory, scheduling maintenance, and ensuring that every aspect of the base's operations would showcase maximum efficiency during the inspection. She caught problems that would have been embarrassing, identified opportunities that would impress the visitors, and created a logistics plan that would make the base look like a model of military excellence. The inspection began at 0800 hours on a Thursday morning. Sarah had been awake since 0400, making final checks and ensuring everything was perfect. The Pentagon team arrived precisely on schedule, and for the next 6 hours they toured every inch of the facility. Everything went flawlessly. Equipment was exactly where it was supposed to be. Personnel were properly prepared and positioned. Supply areas were organized and fully stocked. The visitors took notes constantly, their expressions showing clear approval of what they observed. By 1400 hours, the formal inspection was complete. and the Pentagon team gathered with Admiral Hensley and senior staff for a preliminary debriefing. Sarah stood at the back of the room, exhausted but satisfied that she had delivered exactly what was required. "Admiral Hensley," the lead inspector said, "this is one of the finest operations we've reviewed this year. Your logistics coordination is exceptional, your personnel are well prepared, and your resource management is a model for other facilities." Hensley accepted the praise with characteristic arrogance, as if the success had been entirely his doing. He made no mention of Sarah's role, instead taking credit for the leadership vision that had created such an efficient operation. But the lead inspector wasn't finished. "We'd particularly like to commend whoever coordinated the logistics for today's inspection. The level of detail and organization we observed reflects exceptional competence." Admiral Hensley's smile faltered slightly. "Well, that would be the result of our overall operational excellence." "Actually," interjected Captain Morrison, one of the senior staff members who had watched Sarah's work over the past months, "Lieutenant Mitchell deserves credit for coordinating today's logistics. She's been working around the clock to ensure everything went perfectly." The inspector turned towards Sarah, studying her with new interest. "Lieutenant Mitchell, would you be the same officer who authored the cost-efficiency analysis that's been circulating at the Pentagon?" Sarah was surprised. She hadn't known her report had reached beyond the base. "Yes, sir, though I'm not sure how widely it's been distributed." "It's been distributed widely enough," the inspector said with a slight smile. "Your recommendations have been praised as some of the most insightful logistics analysis produced by junior officers in recent years. We've been hoping to meet you during this visit." Admiral Hensley's face went pale. He had no idea that Sarah's work had gained attention at the Pentagon level, or that suppressing her report might have been seen as failing to forward valuable intelligence up the chain of command. "In fact," the inspector continued, "we'd like to schedule a follow-up meeting with Lieutenant Mitchell to discuss implementing some of her recommendations at other facilities." The room fell silent. Sarah felt a moment of vindication, but also a growing sense of dread. She could see the fury building in Admiral Hensley's eyes, and she knew that this public recognition would only intensify his hostility toward her. The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises of follow-up communications. The Pentagon team departed, leaving behind glowing preliminary reports that would secure the base's funding for years to come. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it set the stage for the confrontation that would change everything. That evening, Admiral Hensley called a General Assembly for the following morning. All personnel were required to attend, he announced, for a special ceremony recognizing the successful inspection. Sarah knew immediately that this was not going to be a celebration. She was right. The morning of the assembly dawned clear and hot, with the Arizona sun promising another scorching day. Nearly 1,000 soldiers, sailors, and officers gathered on the main parade ground, forming perfect formations under the blazing sky. Sarah stood with her unit, watching as Admiral Hensley took the podium. His speech began predictably, praising the overall excellence of the base and the dedication of its personnel. But as he continued, his tone grew darker, his words more pointed. "However," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembly, "I want to address a concerning trend I've observed among some of our junior officers. There seems to be confusion about the chain of command, about respect for authority, and about the proper way to conduct oneself in a military environment." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She knew exactly where this was heading. "Yesterday, during our inspection, I witnessed behavior that was completely unacceptable from an officer who should know better. Grandstanding, self-promotion, and a complete disregard for proper military protocols." He paused, his eyes scanning the assembled troops before settling directly on Sarah. "Lieutenant Mitchell, step forward." The words echoed across the parade ground like a gunshot. Sarah felt 1,000 pairs of eyes turned toward her as she stepped out of formation and marched to the front of the assembly. Her mind raced, trying to anticipate what was coming. But she maintained her military bearing despite the fear building in her chest. "Lieutenant," Admiral Hensley said, his voice now amplified so every person present could hear clearly, "yesterday you chose to embarrass your commanding officer in front of Pentagon inspectors. You took credit for work that was accomplished by this entire command, and you showed a complete lack of respect for the chain of command." Sarah stood at attention, her eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the Admiral's shoulder. She knew that anything she said would only make things worse, but she also knew that her silence might be interpreted as guilt. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Lieutenant?" Hensley demanded. Sarah made her choice. "Sir, I did not take credit for anyone else's work. I was asked directly about my role in coordinating logistics, and I answered honestly. I have shown nothing but respect for the chain of command throughout my service at this base. The words were barely out of her mouth when Admiral Hensley's face went red with rage. In that moment, something inside him snapped. Years of resentment, months of frustration, and the humiliation of having his authority questioned in front of his peers combined into a fury that overwhelmed his judgment. Without warning, without thought of consequences, Admiral Robert Hensley drew back his hand and struck Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell across the face in front of 1,000 watching soldiers. The crack of his palm against her cheek echoed across the silent parade ground like thunder. For a moment, time seemed frozen. Sarah stood there, her face stinging, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Around her, 1,000 military personnel watched in stunned silence, witnessing something that went beyond any acceptable bounds of military discipline. Admiral Hensley stood breathing heavily, his hands still raised, apparently as shocked by his own action as everyone else. He had just committed an assault in front of witnesses, destroyed his own career, and created a moment that would be remembered long after both he and Sarah were gone. But in that frozen moment, Sarah Mitchell made a decision that would define the rest of her life and change military culture forever. She was not going to let this stand. The silence that followed Admiral Hensley's strike seemed to stretch forever. But in reality, it lasted less than 3 seconds. 3 seconds during which Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell's world crystallized into perfect clarity. She could feel the burn of his palm print on her cheek, could taste the metallic tang of blood where her teeth had cut her lip, could sense the collective intake of breath from 1,000 watching soldiers. In those 3 seconds, every moment of harassment, every humiliation, every deliberate attempt to break her spirit flashed through her mind. The late-night assignments designed to wear her down. The reports dismissed without consideration. The comments about women not belonging in the military. The systematic campaign to destroy her confidence and force her resignation. It all led to this moment. Sarah's military training had taught her many things. Discipline, respect for authority, the importance of following orders and maintaining the chain of command. But her training had also taught her something else. That sometimes, when faced with injustice, a soldier's duty is not to submit, but to fight back. Admiral Hensley was still standing there, his hand beginning to lower, his face showing the first signs of realization about what he had just done. Around them, the assembled troops remained frozen in shock, unsure how to process what they had witnessed. In the military hierarchy, they all understood. Striking a subordinate officer was not just inappropriate, it was criminal assault. Sarah looked directly into Admiral Hensley's eyes and saw something she had never seen there before: uncertainty. For the first time in their long conflict, he looked less like an untouchable authority figure and more like what he really was, a bully who had just gone too far. That's when she hit him back. Sarah's right fist connected with Admiral Hensley's jaw with all the force she could muster. The punch was technically perfect, driven by 18 months of suppressed anger and delivered with the precision of someone who had grown up working alongside men who respected strength above all else. The impact sent Hensley staggering backward, his eyes wide with shock, his hands reaching instinctively toward his face. But Sarah wasn't finished. Before the Admiral could recover his balance, she stepped forward and threw a second punch. This one, catching him in the solar plexus. The blow doubled him over, forcing the air from his lungs in a whoosh that was audible across the silent parade ground. Admiral Robert Hensley, the man who had terrorized subordinates for decades, who had built his career on intimidation and fear, collapsed to his knees in front of 1,000 witnesses. The parade ground erupted. Soldiers broke formation, some rushing forward to help the fallen admiral, others simply standing and staring in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Officers shouted contradictory orders, unsure whether they should arrest Sarah, assist Hensley, or simply pretend the entire incident had never happened. Sarah stood over the Admiral's prone form, her chest heaving, her knuckles already beginning to swell. The immediate rush of satisfaction she felt at seeing her tormentor helpless was quickly replaced by the cold realization of what she had just done. She had struck a superior officer. She had destroyed her own military career. She had likely committed a court-martial offense that could result in years of imprisonment, but as she looked around at the faces surrounding her, Sarah realized something unexpected. The expressions she saw were not filled with condemnation or horror. Instead, she saw something that looked remarkably like approval. Sergeant Martinez, a career soldier with 20 years of service, was the first to speak. "About time someone stood up to that bastard," he said quietly, but loud enough for those around him to hear. The comment sparked a ripple of murmurs throughout the crowd. Other soldiers began sharing their own stories of Admiral Hensley's abuse, their voices growing bolder as they realized they were not alone in their feelings. "He's been a bully for years," said Petty Officer Williams, "always picking on anyone he thought couldn't fight back. Remember what he did to Lieutenant Rodriguez last year?" added Corman Davis, destroyed that man's career over nothing. Admiral Hensley was slowly getting to his feet, supported by two officers who had rushed to his aid. His face was already beginning to swell where Sarah's punch had connected, and his breathing was still labored from the blow to his chest. But more than physical pain, he seemed to be suffering from the realization that his authority had been shattered in front of his entire command. "Arrest her," he gasped, pointing a shaking finger at Sarah. "I want that officer arrested immediately." But something extraordinary happened next. The military police officers who should have immediately moved to restrain Sarah hesitated. They looked around at the crowd of soldiers, saw the expressions on their faces, and seemed to recognize that arresting the woman who had finally stood up to Hensley might spark something far worse than the incident they had just witnessed.
Captain Morrison, the senior officer who had earlier credited Sarah for her logistics work, stepped forward.
As the ranking officer present besides Hensley, his next words would determine how the situation unfolded. "Admiral," he said carefully, "perhaps we should discuss this situation privately before taking any official action." Hensley's face went red again, this time with fury rather than physical pain. "There's nothing to discuss." She struck a superior officer in front of the entire command. "I want her in the brig immediately." But Captain Morrison stood his ground. "Sir, with respect, what I witnessed was a subordinate officer defending herself after being physically assaulted by her commanding officer. Any official action should probably consider all aspects of the incident." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison was essentially telling Admiral Hensley that he would testify that the Admiral had struck first, that Sarah's retaliation had been self-defense rather than insubordination. Other officers began to nod in agreement. Major Patterson stepped forward. "Captain Morrison is right, sir. Any investigation should examine the complete sequence of events." The crowd was growing restless. What had started as a routine assembly had become something unprecedented, a spontaneous uprising against years of authoritarian abuse. Soldiers who had individually suffered under Hensley's command were realizing that they were part of a much larger pattern of mistreatment. Admiral Hensley looked around at the faces surrounding him, and for the first time in his career, he saw something that terrified him more than enemy fire or career-ending mistakes. He saw his own subordinates looking at him with open contempt. "This assembly is dismissed," he announced, his voice cracking slightly. "Everyone return to your duties immediately." But the crowd didn't move. Instead, they continued to stand there, watching, waiting, to see what would happen next. It was as if 30 years of military conditioning had been suspended, replaced by something more fundamental, a recognition that what they had witnessed went beyond normal military discipline. Sarah remained at attention, her hands at her sides, her face a mask of military composure despite the turmoil she felt inside. She knew that the next few minutes would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the fate of everyone present. If Admiral Hensley chose to make this a test of his authority, it could result in multiple court-martials and destroyed careers. But something else was happening. Word of the incident was already spreading beyond the parade ground. Cell phones were appearing, despite regulations against their use during formations. Soldiers were sending texts, making quick calls, posting on social media. Within minutes, news of what had happened would be circulating throughout the entire military community. Admiral Hensley seemed to recognize this as well. His eyes darted toward the phones, understanding that his options for controlling the narrative were rapidly disappearing. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, his voice now carefully controlled, "report to my office in 1 hour for disciplinary action." Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir." The crowd began to slowly disperse, but not before something unprecedented happened. As soldiers passed by Sarah, many of them made eye contact and nodded approvingly. Some even whispered words of encouragement. "You did the right thing," said Sergeant Kim as she walked past. "Somebody had to stand up to him," added Corporal Jackson. By the time Sarah was alone on the parade ground, she realized that something fundamental had changed. The incident hadn't just been about one lieutenant standing up to one admiral. It had become a symbol of resistance against all the petty tyrannies and abuses that soldiers endured from officers who believed their rank made them untouchable. Sarah walked slowly back to her barracks, her mind racing with the implications of what had just occurred. She had likely ended her military career, but she had also done something that felt necessary and right. For the first time in 18 months, she felt like herself again. Her phone was already buzzing with messages from fellow officers who had heard about the incident. Word was spreading fast, and the story was growing with each telling. By evening, she knew military bases across the country would be talking about the lieutenant who had knocked out an admiral. In her room, Sarah sat on her bunk and tried to prepare herself for what was coming. There would be an investigation. There would probably be a court-martial. Her military career was almost certainly over, and she might face criminal charges. But as she replayed the moment in her mind, she realized she had no regrets. She had endured months of harassment and abuse, had tried to handle the situation through proper channels, had maintained her professionalism even when treated with contempt. When Admiral Hensley had finally crossed the line into physical assault, she had responded the only way that felt honest and true to herself. Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed her father's number, and she realized that news of the incident had already reached civilian circles. "Sarah?" Her father's voice was concerned but not accusatory. "I just heard something on the news about an incident at your base. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Dad," she said quietly. "But I think I'm probably in a lot of trouble. Do you want to tell me what happened?" Sarah found herself recounting the entire story, from the months of harassment to the moment she had struck back. Her father listened without interruption, and when she finished, there was a long silence. "Sarah," he finally said, "I'm proud of you." The words brought tears to her eyes. Throughout her military career, she had tried to make her family proud by excelling within the system, by proving that she could succeed despite the obstacles. But now, facing the end of that career, she realized that the moment she had truly made her father proud was when she had refused to accept abuse and had fought back. Over the next few hours, Sarah's phone continued to ring. Fellow officers called to offer support. Friends from the Naval Academy reached out after seeing news reports. Even her old commanding officer from her previous assignment called to say that he was backing her completely. But the most surprising call came from an unexpected source. "Lieutenant Mitchell? This is Admiral Patricia Collins from the Pentagon." Sarah's heart stopped. Admiral Collins was one of the highest-ranking women in the Navy, a legend who had broken barriers throughout her career. "Ma'am?" "Lieutenant, I've been following the reports from your base today. I want you to know that there are people here who understand what you've been going through and what you did today." Sarah was speechless. "I know you're probably expecting the worst," Admiral Collins continued, "but I want you to understand something. What happened today wasn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern of behavior that the Navy can no longer tolerate. Your actions have created an opportunity for us to address problems that have been ignored for too long." "I'm not sure I understand, ma'am." "Lieutenant, you're not the only officer who has filed complaints about Admiral Hensley. Over the past 2 years, we've received multiple reports of harassment, discrimination, and abuse of authority. The problem has been that individual complaints could be dismissed or covered up. But what happened today, in front of 1,000 witnesses, makes that impossible." Sarah began to understand. Her moment of retaliation hadn't just been an act of personal defiance. It had become a catalyst that could finally bring accountability to a system that had protected abusive officers for too long. "What happens now, ma'am?"
"Now, Lieutenant, you're going to be investigated."
"But so is Admiral Hensley. And I suspect that when all the facts come out, people will understand why you did what you did." The call ended, leaving Sarah with something she hadn't expected to feel: hope. Outside her window, she could see other soldiers talking in small groups, their conversations animated and intense. The incident had awakened something in the base community, a recognition that they didn't have to accept abuse from those in authority. Sarah understood that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. She might face court-martial, might be discharged from the military, might even face criminal charges. But she also knew that she had done something important, something that would resonate far beyond her own situation. As night fell over Naval Air Station Phoenix, Sarah Mitchell prepared for whatever was coming next. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had taken a stand that would define her for the rest of her life, and despite the uncertainty of her future, she knew she had made the right choice. The investigation began before Sarah even arrived at Admiral Hensley's office for her scheduled disciplinary meeting. By 0900 hours the morning after the incident, 2 black sedans had arrived at Naval Air Station Phoenix, carrying a team of investigators from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. The Pentagon had moved with unprecedented speed, recognizing that the situation required immediate and careful handling. Sarah walked through the base toward the Admiral's office, acutely aware of how different everything felt. Soldiers she passed offered subtle nods of support, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright admiration. Word of the incident had spread throughout the entire installation overnight, and she was beginning to understand that her story had taken on a life of its own. When she reached the administrative building, she was surprised to find that she wasn't directed to Admiral Hensley's office as expected. Instead, A young ensign escorted her to a conference room where 3 NCIS investigators waited along with Captain Morrison and a woman in Navy dress uniform whom Sarah didn't recognize. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Captain Morrison said as she entered the room, "this is Commander Jennifer Hayes from the Pentagon's Equal Opportunity Office, and these are Special Agents Rodriguez, Chen, and Walker from NCIS." Sarah took the offered seat, her mind racing. The presence of investigators from Washington made it clear that this situation was being taken seriously at the highest levels of military command. Special Agent Rodriguez, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, spoke first. "Lieutenant, before we begin, I want you to understand that you have the right to legal representation during this interview. Would you like an attorney present?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Am I being charged with a crime?" "At this point, we're conducting a preliminary investigation into all aspects of yesterday's incident," Agent Chen answered. "That includes Admiral Hensley's actions as well as your own."
I'll proceed without an attorney for now, Sarah decided.
"But I reserve the right to request representation if needed." Commander Hayes leaned forward. "Lieutenant, I've reviewed your personnel file extensively. Your record of service has been exemplary throughout your career. Yesterday's incident appears to be completely out of character for you. Can you help us understand what led to that moment?" For the next 3 hours, Sarah recounted her entire experience at Naval Air Station Phoenix. She began with her arrival and Admiral Hensley's initial hostility, then detailed 18 months of systematic harassment, professional sabotage, and increasingly personal attacks. She provided dates, specific incidents, and the names of witnesses who had observed the Admiral's behavior. The investigators took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. Sarah could see their expressions growing more serious as her story unfolded. "Lieutenant," Agent Walker said when she finished, "you mentioned that you documented many of these incidents. Do you have copies of that documentation?"
Yes, sir. I kept detailed records, including emails, assignment orders, and contemporaneous notes of verbal interactions.
"We'll need to see all of that," Agent Rodriguez said. "Can you provide those materials today?" "I have everything in my quarters. I can retrieve it immediately." While Sarah was escorted back to her barracks to gather her documentation, the investigators were conducting parallel interviews throughout the base. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture of Admiral Hensley's command style that went far beyond his treatment of Sarah. Petty Officer Williams told them about the Admiral's practice of assigning sailors to dangerous maintenance tasks without proper safety equipment when they had displeased him. Sergeant Martinez described how Hensley had denied leave requests for family emergencies if he felt the soldier hadn't shown sufficient deference. Lieutenant Commander Torres recounted how the Admiral had blocked her promotion for 2 years after she had questioned one of his decisions in a staff meeting. The pattern that emerged was clear. Admiral Robert Hensley had been using his position to punish anyone who challenged his authority, regardless of military regulations or basic human decency. But the investigators also uncovered something else. They discovered that multiple complaints about Admiral Hensley had been filed over the past 2 years, but had been buried or dismissed by his superiors. The military's traditional reluctance to challenge senior officers had allowed his abusive behavior to continue unchecked. When Sarah returned with her documentation, Agent Chen reviewed the materials with growing amazement. Sarah had kept meticulous records, including copies of every assignment, notes from every meeting, and detailed accounts of every incident of harassment or discrimination.
Lieutenant, this level of documentations is extraordinary, Agent Chen said.
"You've essentially created a complete record of systematic harassment and abuse of authority." Commander Hayes was reviewing Sarah's original logistics report, the one that had gained attention at the Pentagon. "Lieutenant, I have to ask, why didn't you request a transfer? With your record and qualifications, you could have easily moved to another assignment." Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "Ma'am, I thought about it many times, but transferring would have felt like running away, and it wouldn't have solved the underlying problem. Admiral Hensley would still be here, still treating other officers the same way. I felt like I had an obligation to see if the situation could be resolved properly. And when it became clear that proper channels weren't working, I decided I wasn't going to be driven out of the Navy by someone who was abusing his authority. I earned my place here, and I wasn't going to let him take that away from me." The investigation continued for 3 days. During that time, Admiral Hensley was relieved of command and confined to quarters pending the outcome of the inquiry. Captain Morrison was appointed as temporary commanding officer, and the entire atmosphere of the base began to change. Word of the investigation spread throughout the military community like wildfire. Military blogs and forums were filled with discussions of the incident. Social media posts from active duty personnel expressed overwhelming support for Sarah's actions. The story was even picked up by civilian news outlets with headlines like Navy Lieutenant Fights Back Against Abuse and Military Officers Stand Against Harassment Sparks Investigation. On the third day of the investigation, Sarah was called back for a final interview. This time, Admiral Patricia Collins was present via video conference from the Pentagon. Lieutenant Mitchell, Admiral Collins began. I've reviewed the complete findings of this investigation. What I've learned is deeply troubling, but it's also provided us with an opportunity to address systemic problems that have been ignored for too long. Sarah waited, unsure what was coming next. The investigation has uncovered clear evidence that Admiral Hensley engaged in a pattern of harassment, discrimination, and abuse of authority that violated numerous military regulations and federal laws. His physical assault on you was the culmination of months of illegal behavior. Agent Rodriguez picked up the narrative. Lieutenant, we've also reviewed the circumstances of your retaliation. While striking a superior officer is normally a serious offense, the evidence clearly shows that you were defending yourself after being assaulted. Your actions fall within the legal definition of self-defense. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she sensed there was more to come. Commander Hayes spoke next. Lieutenant, your documentation and testimony have been instrumental in exposing problems that extend far beyond Admiral Hensley's individual behavior. We've discovered that similar complaints have been filed and ignored at other installations as well. Admiral Collins leaned forward on the video screen. Lieutenant, the Navy is implementing new policies for reporting and investigating harassment and discrimination. We're also creating new oversight mechanisms to ensure that complaints are properly investigated rather than buried. What does this mean for me, ma'am? Sarah asked. It means, Lieutenant, that you're not being court-martialed. In fact, you're being commended for your courage in exposing serious violations of military law and regulations. Sarah felt tears starting in her eyes, but she maintained her composure. More than that, Admiral Collins continued, I'd like to offer you a new assignment. The Pentagon needs officers with your integrity and analytical skills to help implement these new policies. Would you be interested in a position with the Equal Opportunity Office in Washington? The offer was stunning. Not only was Sarah avoiding punishment, she was being offered a career opportunity that could help prevent other officers from facing the same abuse she had endured. Ma'am, I would be honored to accept that assignment. Excellent. Report to Washington in 30 days. You'll be working directly with my office to develop new training programs and oversight procedures. The meeting concluded with handshakes and congratulations. As Sarah left the conference room, she realized that her moment of retaliation had transformed her from a victim of abuse into an agent of change. But the investigation's conclusions weren't just important for Sarah's future. They sent shockwaves throughout the military establishment. Admiral Hensley was court-martialed and dishonorably discharged, his 34-year career ending in disgrace. More significantly, the investigation prompted a service-wide review of harassment and discrimination complaints, leading to the discovery of similar patterns at dozens of other installations. Changes that followed were unprecedented. New reporting procedures were established that bypassed local chains of command for harassment complaints. Training programs were implemented for all officers on appropriate conduct and abuse of authority. Most importantly, a new oversight office was created with the authority to investigate senior officers without interference from local commanders. Sarah's story became a case study taught at military academies and leadership schools. Her documentation methods became the model for how service members should protect themselves when facing harassment. Her decision to fight back rather than transfer became an example of moral courage under pressure. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. Throughout the military, the story of Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell became a symbol that abuse of authority would no longer be tolerated. Officers who had been bullying subordinates suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Service members who had been suffering in silence began to speak up, knowing that their complaints would be taken seriously. The incident also sparked conversations in civilian society about workplace harassment and the importance of standing up to abuse. Sarah received letters from women in corporate environments, academic institutions, and other organizations who were inspired by her example to confront their own situations. 3 weeks after the investigation concluded, Sarah was packing her belongings for her move to Washington when Captain Morrison stopped by her quarters. Lieutenant, I wanted to thank you personally for what you've done, he said. I know it cost you a lot, and I know it wasn't easy. Thank you, sir, but I think it was necessary. It absolutely was. You should know that the morale on this base has completely changed since Admiral Hensley was removed. People are actually enjoying their work again. Sarah nodded. That's what makes it all worthwhile. As Captain Morrison turned to leave, he paused. "Lieutenant, can I ask you something? When you threw that punch, did you know it would lead to all this?" Sarah considered the question. "No, sir. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about investigations or policy changes or career opportunities. I was just thinking that I wasn't going to let him hit me and get away with it. Sometimes," Captain Morrison said with a smile, "the most important actions are the ones we take without thinking about the consequences." After he left, Sarah continued packing, reflecting on how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. She had gone from being an isolated target of harassment to being a symbol of resistance and change. Her military career, which had seemed over, was now taking an entirely new direction that would allow her to help protect other service members from similar abuse. But the most important change was internal. For months, Sarah had felt powerless, constantly on the defensive, fighting just to survive in an hostile environment. Now she felt strong again, confident in her abilities and her principles. She had learned that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply refuse to accept injustice, even when the cost seems too high to bear. Her moment of retaliation had been brief, lasting only seconds, but its consequences would reshape military culture for generations to come. As Sarah prepared for her new life in Washington, she knew that her fight was far from over. There would be other Admiral Hensleys, other systems that protected abusers, other victims who needed someone to stand with them. But she also knew that change was possible, that courage was contagious, and that sometimes one person's refusal to back down could inspire an entire institution to examine its conscience and choose a better path forward. 6 months after arriving at the Pentagon, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood before a room filled with the most senior officers in the United States Navy. Her presentation materials were spread across the conference table, and the slides on the screen behind her displayed statistics that would have been unthinkable to share just a year earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal, "our investigation has identified systematic patterns of harassment and discrimination at 47 military installations worldwide. The economic cost of lost talent, early separations, and decreased morale is estimated at over $200 million annually." Admiral Patricia Collins sat at the head of the table, her expression grave as she reviewed the comprehensive report that Sarah's team had compiled. The Equal Opportunity Office had been transformed from a largely ceremonial department into a powerful investigative body with direct reporting authority to the highest levels of military command. Sarah clicked to the next slide, which showed retention rates for female officers over the past decade. More significantly, we're losing some of our most capable officers. 38% of women who separate from the Navy before completing their initial obligations cite harassment or discrimination as a primary factor. The room was silent as the implications sank in. These weren't just numbers on a chart, they represented thousands of talented individuals who had been driven from military service by the kind of systematic abuse Sarah herself had experienced. "What are your recommendations, Lieutenant?" asked Admiral Richardson, the Chief of Naval Operations. Sarah had been preparing for this question for months. "Sir, our findings suggest 3 critical areas for immediate action. First, we need to completely restructure how harassment complaints are reported and investigated. Second, we need mandatory training for all officers on appropriate conduct and the consequences of abuse of authority. Third, and most importantly, we need to create accountability mechanisms that ensure senior officers face real consequences for allowing abusive environments to persist." The presentation continued for another hour, with Sarah detailing specific policy recommendations, implementation timelines, and success metrics. When she finished, Admiral Richardson leaned back in his chair. "Lieutenant, this is the most comprehensive analysis of military culture problems I've seen in my 30-year career. How quickly can these recommendations be implemented?" "Sir, we could begin pilot programs at selected installations within 60 days. Full implementation across all Navy facilities could be completed within 18 months. Admiral Collins smiled. "Make it happen, Lieutenant. You have full authority to proceed." As the meeting dispersed, Sarah gathered her materials with a sense of satisfaction she had never experienced during her time at Naval Air Station Phoenix. Her work was having real impact, creating changes that would protect thousands of service members from the kind of abuse she had endured. But her transformation into an advocate for military reform hadn't been easy. The first months in Washington had been overwhelming, as Sarah discovered the true scope of the problem she was tasked with solving. Her own experience, which had seemed isolated and personal, was actually part of a much larger pattern of institutional failure. She had interviewed hundreds of service members who had faced harassment, discrimination, or abuse. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar. Talented individuals who had been targeted by superiors who abused their authority, who had tried to work within the system only to be ignored or retaliated against, who had ultimately been forced to choose between their principles and their careers. The more Sarah learned, the more she understood that her confrontation with Admiral Hensley had been significant not because it was unique, but because it had finally been public enough and dramatic enough to force the military to confront problems it had been avoiding for decades. Her own story had become something of a legend within military circles. The details had grown in the telling. Some versions had her knocking out the Admiral with a single punch. Others described a prolonged fight that left Hensley unconscious for several minutes. Sarah had stopped correcting the embellishments, understanding that the myth served a purpose beyond the facts. It gave other service members hope that abuse of authority could be confronted and overcome. But the real transformation hadn't been in her public reputation. It had been in her understanding of her own role and responsibility within the military structure. During her months at the Pentagon, Sarah had met with civilian leaders, members of Congress, and advocacy groups who were pushing for military reform. She had learned about legislative efforts to address sexual assault and harassment in the military, about civilian oversight mechanisms, and about the complex relationship between military culture and broader society. One particularly meaningful encounter had been with Senator Elizabeth Warren, who was leading congressional efforts to reform military justice procedures. During their meeting, Senator Warren had asked Sarah a question that continued to resonate with her. "Lieutenant, you've experienced both the worst and the best of military culture. What would you tell young women who are considering military service?"
Sarah had thought carefully before answering.
"I would tell them that the military is still struggling with problems that should have been solved decades ago. But I would also tell them that their presence and their voices are part of the solution. Every woman who serves with distinction, who stands up for herself and others, who refuses to accept discrimination as normal, every one of those women makes it easier for the next generation."
The senator had nodded approvingly.
That's exactly the kind of leadership the military needs. Sarah's work at the Pentagon had also brought her into contact with civilian organizations working on workplace harassment and discrimination. White Pentagon, waving over as dead fire. She had spoken at conferences, participated in panel discussions, and consulted with corporations trying to improve their own workplace cultures. These experiences had broadened her perspective on the issues she was addressing. The problems she had faced weren't unique to the military. They existed in corporate boardrooms, academic institutions, and every other environment where power dynamics created opportunities for abuse. But she had also learned that the military's rigid hierarchy and culture of obedience made it particularly susceptible to these problems and particularly resistant to change. 1 year after her confrontation with Admiral Hensley, Sarah was invited to speak at the Naval Academy graduation ceremony. Standing at the podium where she had once received her own commission, she looked out at 500 newly commissioned officers and tried to find words that would prepare them for the challenges they would face. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "you are graduating into a military that is undergoing fundamental changes. Some of those changes are long overdue. Some of them are difficult and uncomfortable, but all of them are necessary." She paused, looking specifically at the female graduates scattered throughout the audience. "You will face situations where you have to choose between going along with behavior that you know is wrong and standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. I'm here to tell you that standing up is always worth it, even when the cost seems too high to bear." After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by a young female ensign who reminded her powerfully of herself at that age. Confident, idealistic, ready to prove herself in a challenging environment. "Lieutenant, I've read about what happened to you," the ensign said. "I'm being assigned to a base where the commanding officer has a reputation for being difficult with female officers. Do you have any advice?" Sarah considered her words carefully. "Document everything. Trust your instincts. Don't accept inappropriate behavior as normal just because others have tolerated it. And remember that you're not just representing yourself. You're helping to create the environment that future officers will inherit." The young ensign nodded seriously. "What if the situation becomes impossible? Then you do what's necessary to protect yourself and others. But you never let anyone convince you that you don't belong or that you're not capable of excellent service." As the ensign walked away, Sarah reflected on how much her own perspective had changed. A year earlier, she might have advised the young officer to keep her head down and avoid confrontation. Now she understood that avoiding confrontation often meant allowing problems to persist and grow worse. Sarah's transformation had been professional, but it had also been deeply personal. The shy, uncertain officer who had been intimidated by Admiral Hensley's hostility had been replaced by someone who was comfortable challenging authority when necessary, who could speak truth to power without fear, who understood her own worth and refused to let others diminish it. This personal growth had been accelerated by her work with other survivors of military harassment and discrimination. She had learned that her experience, while traumatic, had also given her insights and credibility that were invaluable in her current role. She had also learned that healing from trauma often meant transforming it into a force for positive change. 6 months into her Pentagon assignment, Sarah had been contacted by a producer from 60 Minutes, who wanted to do a story about military harassment and reform efforts. Sarah had initially been reluctant to participate, not wanting to become a celebrity or have her story sensationalized, but Admiral Collins had encouraged her to consider it. "Lieutenant, your story has already inspired changes that are protecting thousands of service members. Sharing it more widely could amplify that impact." The resulting segment had aired to enormous public response. Sarah's interview, in which she described both her harassment and her decision to fight back, had been viewed millions of times online. The piece had also featured interviews with other service members who had faced similar situations, creating a broader picture of the systemic nature of the problems. The response had been overwhelming. Sarah received thousands of emails and letters from people who had been inspired by her story. Many were from service members who had decided to report harassment they had been enduring in silence. Others were from civilians who had been motivated to address similar problems in their own workplaces. But perhaps the most meaningful responses came from young women who were considering military service. They wrote to tell Sarah that her example had convinced them that they could serve with honor and dignity, that they didn't have to accept abuse as the price of wearing the uniform. One letter in particular had moved Sarah to tears. It was from a high school senior who had been considering abandoning her dream of attending the Naval Academy because she was afraid of facing the kind of harassment she had heard about in military environments. "Lieutenant Mitchell," the letter read, "watching your interview showed me that even if I face difficult situations, I don't have to face them alone. Your courage gives me courage. I've decided to accept my appointment to the Academy, and I hope to serve with the same integrity you've shown." Reading that letter, Sarah understood that her moment of retaliation had been about much more than her own situation. It had been about refusing to accept injustice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had come after her. Her transformation from victim to advocate had been complete, but it was also ongoing. Every day brought new challenges, new opportunities to create positive change, new reminders that the work she was doing mattered. As she prepared for another day of briefings, policy reviews, and strategic planning, Sarah reflected on the unexpected path her career had taken. She had never imagined that her worst moment would become the foundation for her most meaningful work, but she had learned that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never planned to fight, and that sometimes the greatest victories come from refusing to accept defeat when everything seems lost. The Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell who walked into the Pentagon each morning was fundamentally different from the officer who had stood on that parade ground 18 months earlier. She was stronger, more confident, more aware of her own power and responsibility. But she was also the same person who had refused to back down when faced with injustice, who had chosen to fight rather than flee, who had believed that her principles mattered more than her personal safety. That core of integrity and courage hadn't changed, it had just found its true purpose. 5 years after the incident that changed her life, Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, preparing to address the largest gathering of military reform advocates in American history. The crowd stretched from the memorial to the Washington Monument, 50,000 people who had come to demand continued progress in military culture and accountability. The transformation in her rank was only the most visible sign of how much had changed. Sarah's work at the Pentagon had been so successful that she had been promoted ahead of schedule twice, and she now led the newly created Office of Military Culture Reform, a department that reported directly to the Secretary of Defense. But the real measure of change wasn't in her personal advancement. It was in the stories that reached her desk every day. Stories of service members who had been protected by the new policies she had helped create, of careers that had been saved by improved reporting mechanisms, of toxic commanders who had been held accountable for their actions. As she looked out at the crowd, Sarah could see uniformed service members standing alongside civilian advocates, veterans organizations, and family members who had been affected by military harassment and discrimination.
The coalition that had formed around these issues had become a powerful force for continued reform.
"Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the memorial grounds. 5 years ago, I was a lieutenant who had been pushed to her breaking point by systematic harassment and abuse. Today, I stand before you as evidence that change is possible, that justice can prevail, and that courage can triumph over entrenched power. The crowd erupted in applause, but Sarah raised her hand for quiet. She had important things to say, and limited time to say them. "But we cannot let progress make us complacent. The changes we've achieved are significant, but they're not sufficient. Too many service members still face harassment, discrimination, and abuse. Too many talented individuals are still being driven from military service by leaders who abuse their authority. Sarah's speech outlined the work that remained to be done. Despite the reforms that had been implemented, recent studies showed that harassment and discrimination remained persistent problems across all branches of the military. The culture change that everyone had hoped for was happening, but slowly and unevenly. As she spoke, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The 5 years since her confrontation with Admiral Hensley had been filled with victories and setbacks, moments of hope and periods of frustration. The immediate aftermath of her Pentagon assignment had been gratifying. The policies she had developed were implemented across the Navy, then adapted by the other service branches. Reporting procedures were streamlined, training programs were enhanced, and oversight mechanisms were strengthened. The results had been measurable. Harassment complaints were being investigated more thoroughly and resolved more fairly. Officers who engaged in abusive behavior were facing real consequences. Retention rates for female service members began to improve. But Sarah had also learned that changing institutional culture was far more complex than changing policies and procedures. Deep-seated attitudes and informal power structures were resistant to formal reform efforts. She had encountered this resistance personally when she was assigned to lead a culture reform initiative at a Marine Corps base in North Carolina. Despite her rank and authority, some senior officers had made it clear that they resented being lectured about military culture by someone they saw as having achieved her position through controversy rather than merit. The resistance had been subtle but persistent. Her recommendations were questioned more thoroughly than those of her male counterparts. Her authority was challenged in ways that would have been unthinkable if she had been a male colonel. Some officers seemed to be waiting for her to fail, to prove that her success had been the result of political correctness rather than competence. But Sarah had persevered, using the same documentation and analytical skills that had served her well during her harassment ordeal. She had methodically addressed every criticism, answered every challenge, and demonstrated through results that her reforms were effective. Slowly, attitudes had begun to shift. Officers who had initially resisted her efforts began to acknowledge that the changes were creating a better working environment for everyone. Harassment complaints decreased, morale improved, and unit cohesion strengthened. The Marine Corps assignment had been a crucial test of Sarah's ability to create change in the most traditional and hierarchical branch of the military. Her success there had established her credibility and led to her current position overseeing reform efforts across all service branches. But the work had taken a personal toll. The constant scrutiny, the need to prove herself repeatedly, the weight of representing not just herself but all women in the military, it had been exhausting in ways that Sarah had not anticipated. She had found support from an unexpected source, Admiral Robert Hensley. 2 years after his court-martial and discharge, Hensley had reached out through an intermediary, requesting a meeting. Sarah's initial reaction had been to refuse, but her curiosity had ultimately overcome her reluctance. They had met at a coffee shop near the Pentagon, two people whose lives had been forever changed by a moment of violence on a parade ground in Arizona. Hensley looked older than his years, his face showing the toll of public disgrace and the loss of the identity that had defined him for decades. He spoke quietly, his voice lacking the commanding presence that had once intimidated subordinates. "Colonel Mitchell," he began, using her current rank, "I owe you an apology that's 5 years overdue. What I did to you was inexcusable, and the way I treated you and other officers under my command was a betrayal of everything the military is supposed to represent." Sarah had listened without interruption as Hensley described his own journey of self-reflection. He had undergone therapy, participated in anger management programs, and spent time working with organizations that help veterans transition to civilian life. The experience had forced him to confront the toxic attitudes that had shaped his leadership style. "I spent my entire career believing that intimidation was the same as leadership, that fear was the same as respect," he continued. "I never understood the damage I was causing, not just to individuals, but to the institution I claimed to serve." Hensley had asked for nothing. Not forgiveness, not absolution, not even understanding. He had simply wanted to acknowledge the harm he had caused and to express his admiration for what Sarah had accomplished in response. "Your courage changed everything," he said as their meeting ended. "Not just for you, but for thousands of people who will never know your name. I hope you understand how important that is." The encounter had been emotionally difficult for Sarah, but it had also been healing in ways she hadn't expected. Seeing Hensley as a broken man rather than a threatening authority figure had helped her process some of the anger and resentment she had carried for years. More importantly, It had reinforced her understanding that the problems she was working to solve weren't really about individual bad actors. They were about systems and cultures that allowed and encouraged abusive behavior. As Sarah concluded her speech at the Lincoln Memorial, she outlined her vision for the future of military culture reform. "We need to move beyond simply punishing bad behavior," she said. "We need to create environments where good leadership is rewarded, where diverse perspectives are valued, where every service member can contribute their best efforts without fear of harassment or discrimination." The crowd's response was enthusiastic, but Sarah knew that the real work would continue in conference rooms and training facilities, in personnel decisions and policy implementations, in the daily interactions between service members at bases around the world. After the rally, Sarah was approached by a young Army captain who introduced herself as Maria Santos. "Colonel Mitchell, I wanted to thank you personally for what you've done. 3 years ago, I was facing harassment from my commanding officer that was very similar to what you experienced. But because of the policies you helped create, I was able to report it through proper channels and have it addressed quickly and fairly." Captain Santos went on to explain that she was now serving as an equal opportunity officer herself, working to implement the reforms that Sarah had pioneered. "Your story gave me the courage to speak up, instead of just enduring it. And now I'm in a position to help other people who find themselves in similar situations." As Sarah listened to Captain Santos, she was reminded of why her work mattered. Each policy change, each training program, each oversight mechanism represented real people whose lives were improved by having better protections and recourse when they faced abuse. But Sarah was also aware that her own story had been transformed into something larger than its original reality. She had become a symbol of resistance and reform, but symbols carried responsibilities that were sometimes difficult to bear. People expected her to be fearless, to always have the right answer, to never show doubt or uncertainty. They wanted her to be the perfect victim who had achieved perfect justice, rather than the complicated human being who was still working to understand and address complex institutional problems. Sarah had learned to navigate these expectations, using her platform to advance important causes while maintaining her own humanity and vulnerability. One of her most important initiatives had been the creation of a mentorship program that connected senior female officers with junior colleagues who were facing challenges similar to what Sarah had experienced. The program provided practical guidance on documentation, reporting procedures, and career development, but it also offered emotional support and the reassurance that came from knowing others had faced similar struggles and survived. Sarah personally mentored a dozen junior officers, sharing not just the story of her confrontation with Admiral Hensley, but the less dramatic day-to-day experiences of building a successful military career while navigating systemic barriers. Her most challenging mentee had been Lieutenant Jennifer Kim, a brilliant young engineer who was being systematically excluded from important projects by a commanding officer who seemed threatened by her capabilities. Unlike Sarah's situation, there was no dramatic incident to document, just a pattern of subtle discrimination that was difficult to prove, but impossible to ignore. Working with Lieutenant Kim had reminded Sarah that most harassment and discrimination was far less dramatic than her own experience, but no less damaging to careers and morale. The reforms she had helped implement were making progress on addressing overt abuse, but the subtler forms of bias and exclusion remained persistent problems. As Sarah prepared for her next assignment, leading a joint task force on military culture reform that included representatives from all NATO countries, she reflected on the unexpected path her career had taken. She had never imagined that a moment of retaliation born from anger and frustration would become the foundation for a life's work dedicated to justice and reform. But she had learned that sometimes the most important contributions come from refusing to accept injustice, even when fighting back seems hopeless. Standing in her Pentagon office, Sarah looked at the photographs on her desk. Pictures from award ceremonies, policy implementation meetings, and mentorship events. But the photo that meant the most to her was a simple snapshot from a recent graduation ceremony at the Naval Academy, showing her shaking hands with a young female ensign who had written to her years earlier about finding courage to pursue her military dreams. That ensign was now beginning her own Navy career, armed with better policies, stronger protections, and the knowledge that she was part of a community of people committed to making military service better for everyone. Sarah understood that her legacy wouldn't be the moment she struck Admiral Hensley, dramatic though that incident had been. Her real legacy would be measured in the careers of young officers who would never face the harassment she had endured, in the policies that would protect service members she would never meet, in the cultural changes that would make the military more just and effective for generations to come. The work was far from finished. There would always be new challenges, new forms of discrimination to address, new barriers to overcome. But Sarah had learnt that progress was possible. that institutions could change, and that individual courage could spark collective action that transformed entire organizations. As she gathered her materials for another day of meetings and policy reviews, Sarah smiled at the thought of how much her life had changed since that morning in Arizona, when she had walked onto a parade ground expecting nothing more than a routine assembly. She had discovered that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply refuse to accept injustice as normal. That refusal, multiplied across thousands of individuals and institutional changes, had the power to transform not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who would follow in her footsteps. Colonel Sarah Mitchell walked out of her office and into another day of building a better military for future generations, carrying with her the knowledge that courage was contagious, that change was possible, and that sometimes the most powerful response to abuse was simply refusing to let it continue.